My name's Jennifer Behrens. I'm the head of reference services at the Goodson Law Library and acting interim director. And on behalf of the Goodson Law Library, I'm so pleased to welcome you all to the 7th annual Alumni Author event in celebration of National Library Week. This series began in 2012 as a celebration of both National Library Week and the law school's reunion weekend, which usually seem to happen around the same time. Our speaker this year is Ben Fountain, a graduate of the JD class of 1983 and the author of critically acclaimed works of fiction and nonfiction alike. You can find his 2006 short story collection, Brief Encounters with Che Guevara, and the 2012 novel, Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, in the library's Alumni Authors Collection, and we look forward to adding his upcoming essay collection, Beautiful Country Burn Again, when it is released later this year. Before we get started, I need to take a moment to thank a few people who helped make this event possible. First and foremost, the library's business manager, Sue Hicks, for her assistance with planning and logistics, our events office and media services staff, the cafe downstairs for catering, and of course, all of you for being here today. Please join me in welcoming Ben Fountain, although, sorry, I should have said, after Ben reads from his works and talks a little bit about his journey from law into writing, there will be a Q&A session moderated by our own Kate Bartlett, Duke's A. Kenneth Pye Professor of Law. So please join me in welcoming both Ben and Kate.
Hello, everybody. I understand my competition today is pharmaceutical pricing. And so if I can't give you guys a better show than pharmaceutical pricing, then just ride me out of town on a rail. Thanks very much to Jennifer Behrens for this invitation and to Sue Hicks for getting me here. And so what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit, I'll read a little bit, and then what I really look forward to most is having a conversation with y'all. And I see some former professors here of mine, Dean Bartlett, Professor Beal, Professor Schmalbach back there trying to hide. Anyway, so I graduated in 1983. I started in 1980. Back then, the law school was a rather drab red brick building. The Fuqua School of Business was a patch of woods next door. The Sanford School of Public Policy there was a patch of woods and then a dirt parking lot over there. And at least once a week, somebody had the battery stolen out of their car over there. So it was kind of like Russian roulette. If you parked over there, your car might not start. When you got out of class, there was no cafe. We did have vending machines. They got serviced about once a year. We had a pinball machine for a while, and then Dean Carrington took it away. He decided that some of the guys were spending far too much time playing pinball, so we just went over to the Hideaway and drank beer. Instead, one of my chief memories of first year is things were going okay for the first couple of weeks. It was like, I can do this. And then they gave us the blue book. And do they still have the blue book? And is it still this stupid little blue book? Like something like Jehovah's Witness passes out, when they come to your door. And so I started looking at that, and I had one of the first of many first-year meltdowns. Just looking at this thing and thinking, what have I gotten myself into? I was an English major, so I'm used to citation and form and all that, but this was a different level altogether. So I sprained my ankle running that September, and so I went over to the infirmary to get it x-rayed. And so you don't have a second to spare your first year of law school, and so I thought, I don't want to take a big book, and my ankle's swollen up to the size of a turnip. So I just thought, I'll bring the blue book and study that. And so I was sitting there in the corridor, and I had my foot propped up on a chair, and I got my little blue book out, and I'm reading it. And this African-American gentleman comes down the hall, and he's in scrubs, and he's probably 30. He's got a goatee. This guy, he had his stuff together. He's just a very cool guy. And so he's walking along, and he gets up next to me, and as he passes, he looks down at me and says, "The blue book," and then just kept right on walking. So that was one of the cooler parts of first year. Let's see, the coolest part of third year was getting out. I have to say I met a lot of good people here, made some good friends. I had many fine professors who taught me a lot, some of it useful. No, actually much of it useful. But I have to say one of the happiest days of my life was the day I graduated. I was ready to go. I practiced law in Dallas for 5 years. I think one of the reasons I went to law school was I was trying to avoid writing, this impulse to try to write fiction. It scared me. It seemed like the hardest thing a person could try to do. And I think I was hoping that I would go to law school, start practicing law, have this respectable, lucrative career, be an upstanding member of society, and just forget about writing. But I was turning 30, and I was starting to realize that I would never have any peace in myself if I didn't make a serious attempt to do this kind of work. And so my wife, Sharon, who's Duke Law class of 82, we had talked about it a long time. And she gave her blessing to this enterprise. And so she made partner at her firm on Friday. I gave my notice on Monday. And then 2 weeks later, I'm at home, I sit down at the kitchen table and start to write a short story. And I was terrible. And I would stay terrible for quite a few many years to come. And it's kind of embarrassing, but I'll just put it out there. It took me 10 years to write a story that pleased me. It took me 16 years to get a book contract. If anybody's contemplating doing this kind of work, I hope it happens faster for you. And if you're thinking, God, 16 years to get a book contract, Ben Fountain must be kind of thick. Well, I never said I was fast. To the extent I ever figure anything out, it usually takes me a long time and a lot of work. Eventually, I did publish a short story collection called Brief Encounters with Che Guevara. And in all those years of writing, my extended apprenticeship, I realized I was drawn to stories where the context is power, politics, race, economics, money, how the world works, why it is the way it is, and what these large systems that control so much of our lives, how they affect us, our external lives as well as our interior lives. And it took me a long time to figure out how to write about this. And maybe I've never figured it out, but to the extent I have, you can see the evidence for better or worse in Brief Encounters with Che Guevara. So I'll read a little bit from one of the stories in there. It's called Asian Tiger. And it's about a washed-up American golf pro who had a few good years on the tour. And then he ends up in Myanmar, which used to be called Burma, as the golf pro, like the national ambassador of golf, and working for the junta, the group of generals who run the country. They're crazy for golf, and so he just lands this opportunity. So all right, he had won a tournament in Myanmar, and so that led to the offer to go to work for the generals. By the Tuesday after his victory, he had a Mercedes sedan, a fat US dollar account at the Mayawati Bank, and a rent-free bungalow at the National Golf Club, an antique gem left over from the days of the British Raj. It was a tight, slyly challenging link-style course with lots of blind approaches and tricky doglegs, while its emerald fairways and park-like woods suggested the moist, hushed intimacies of a tropical greenhouse. Only the military, the Tatmadaw, and their relatives and guests were allowed to enjoy the national sumptuous perks. 4 caddies chased wayward shots through the trees, while small boys in skivvies waited by the ponds, poised to dive after balls that found the water. In the clubhouse, a tatty but venerable gingerbread legacy Waiters in starched white jackets served up the best in Indian cuisine and premium liquors. Dear girls, Sonny wrote to his daughters, Carla and Christy, ages 8 and 10, back in Dallas. Your dad is still a golf bum, but he is now making more money than President Bush. I'm going to be sending most of it home to your mother, so please tell her to stop scaring you about the homeless shelter. His first day on the job, he teed it up with the generals and a delegation of Japanese steel tycoons. Happy face, he told himself. Smile, smile, so what if it's golf hell? He jump-started the good karma by thinking about his girls and nuked a drive on number one of such rare and aching profundity that everyone present, generals, tycoons, bodyguards, toothless caddies, emitted an odd, transcendent ah, like the dying chords of the world's largest gong. So he was delivering. Before they got down to discussions about labor capacity and penetrative pricing, the big guys had to bond. And Sonny saw that as his job, supplying the positive vibes. The next day, he walked into the pro shop and found a beautiful oriental vase waiting for him. It's for you, said Tommy Wynn, the pro shop pro. Tommy was a slight, melancholy man in his late 20s who'd started life as a Vietnamese boat person and learned his golf caddying at Singapore's Keppel Club. His English was so rushed and idiomatic that it sounded like change rattling out of a tube. Get out of here, said Sonny. For me? Those guys you played with yesterday, the Japanese, they sent it over. Sonny was afraid to touch it. Why would they do that? Tommy hesitated. They want to be your friend. They want you to like them. Oh. It wasn't so much a bribe as a gesture, a little goodwill grease for the wheels. It wasn't long before Sonny realized that a giant corporate rat fuck was happening out on the course. If you wanted to do business in Burma, you had to cozy up to the generals, and the best place for that was the National's elegant links, which put Sonny in a classic trickle-down position. Over the next few days, he received a case of Bordeaux from Singaporean financiers, a carved elephant from Thai teakwood barons, a kangaroo skin golf bag from Malaysian gem traders. So popular, said Tommy Wynn in a voice like dry ice. 2 weeks in Myanmar and look at all the wonderful friends you have. But Sonny was troubled. These people thought he could pimp for them. He was just the pro, a performing human whose job was to stun them with his mighty swing and tell colorful stories on the veranda after the round. They were all, generals included, relentless jock sniffers, eager for inside information about their favorite pros. Did you ever play with Palmer? They'd ask him over drinks. Was Nicholas really the best? Tell us about Tiger. Is he as good as they say? If Sonny didn't have an actual personal anecdote, he'd make one up, something dramatic or funny to make everybody feel good. Trying to write this kind of fiction, it's tricky because you're going for big stuff, but you can't look like you're going for big stuff. You've got to keep it small at the level of the line, the level of the page, and really it boils down to character, the internal lives of the characters. And so if you're going to write about power, politics, race, economics, it really starts with the people who come to you in the course of writing the story, that those big themes have to come from inside out of the characters as opposed to being layered on from the outside. Anyway, I continued this kind of inquiry through a lot more short stories, through a failed novel, and then I wrote a novel that seemed to work on some level. It's called Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk. And you could call that an inquiry into an era where America seems to have lost its mind. And notice that's in the present tense. I don't think it's gotten any better. It's an era of war and insane budgeting and extreme cruelty and callousness, not only toward our fellow citizens, but to the larger world in general. And so I'll read a little bit from Billy Lynn. Billy Lynn follows a group of American soldiers who have been brought back to the U.S. for 2 weeks to do a so-called victory tour. And their last day of the victory tour, they are guests of honor at a Dallas Cowboys football game, Thanksgiving Day game. And the main character is Billy Lynn. He's a 19-year-old private soldier from Texas. And so they're having lunch in what's called the Stadium Club, which is the fancy schmancy club that used to be in the old Texas Stadium where the Cowboys used to play. So I'll just read you a section out of that. They're interrupted by a Stadium Club patron who wants to say hello. It's never the young or middle-aged men who stop to speak, but always the older guys, the silverbacks secure in the fact that they're past their fighting prime. They thank the soldiers for their service. They ask, how is lunch? They offer praise for such assumed attributes as tenacity, aggressiveness, love of country. This particular patron, a fit, ruddy fellow with some black still in his hair, introduces himself with a lavish trawling of vowels that comes out sounding like How Wayne. Soon he's telling them about the bold new technology his family's oil company uses to juice more crude out of the Barnett Shale, something to do with salt water and chemical fracturing agents. Some of my friends' kids are over there serving with you, Hal Wayne tells them. So it's a personal thing with me, boosting domestic production, lessening our dependence on foreign oil. I figure the better I do my job, the sooner we can bring you young men home. Thank you, Sergeant Dime responds. That's just excellent, sir. We certainly do appreciate that. I'm just trying to do my part. And that was cool, Billy will later reflect. If Hal Wayne had just said, enjoy your meal, like everybody else, and returned to his lucrative patriotic life. But no, he got greedy. He had to squeeze just a little bit more from Bravo. So, he says, just from your own perspective, how do you think we're doing over there? How are we doing? Dime echoes brightly. Just from our own perspective? The Bravos fold their hands and look down at their plates, though several can't help smiling. Well, it's a war, Dime continues in that same bright voice, which is by definition an extreme situation, people trying very hard to terminate each other. But I'm far from qualified to speak to the big picture, sir. All I can tell you with any confidence is the exchange of force with intent to kill, that is truly a mind-altering experience, sir. I'm sure, Hal Wayne is gravely nodding. I can imagine how hard it is on you young men to be exposed to that level of violence. No, Dime interrupts. That's not it at all. We like violence. We like going lethal. I mean, isn't that what you're paying us for? To take the fight to America's enemies and send them straight to hell? If we didn't like killing people, then what's the point? You might as well send in the Peace Corps to fight the war. Aha, Hal Wayne chuckles, though his smile has lost some wattage. I guess you've got me there. Listen, you see these men? Dime gestures around the table. I love every one of these mutts like a brother. I bet I love them more than their mamas even. But I'll tell you frankly, and they know how I feel, so I can say this right in front of them. But just for the record, this is the most murdering bunch of psychopaths you'll ever see. I don't know how they were before the Army got them, but you give them a weapons system and a couple of ripped fuels and they'll blast the hell out of anything that moves. Isn't that right, Bravo? Yes, Sergeant! They answer instantly with gusto. Throughout the restaurant, dozens of well-coiffed heads whip around. See what I mean, Dime Quartles? They're killers. They're having the time of their lives. So if your family's oil company wants to frack the living shit out of the Barnett Shale, that's fine, sir. That's absolutely your prerogative. But don't be doing it on our account. You've got your business and we've got ours. So you just keep on drilling, sir, and we'll keep on killing. Hal Wayne opens his mouth and flaps his jaw once or twice, but nothing comes out. His eyes have receded deep into his head. Behold, Billy thinks, the world's most mind-fucked millionaire. I've got to go, Hal Wayne mumbles, glancing around as if checking his escape route. Don't talk about shit you don't know, Billy thinks, and therein lies the dynamic of all such encounters. The Bravos speak from the high ground of experience. They are authentic. They are the real. They have dealt much death and received much death and smelled it and held it and slopped through it in their boots, had it spattered on their clothes and tasted it in their mouths. That is their advantage, and given the masculine standard America has set for itself, it is interesting how few actually qualify. Why we fight? Yo, who is this we? Here in the chicken hawk nation of blowhards and bluffers, Bravo always has the ace of bloods up its sleeve. So the inquiry continues. power, politics, race, why the world is the way it is. Is there any justice in the world? And maybe we can talk about justice a little bit. But I realize on some level that's what I'm writing about, justice. And what does it consist of? Where does that impulse come from? What does it mean for society and for, the American religion of markets and capitalism? So I've continued to write stories along these themes. I'm 400 pages into a novel set in Haiti. But in 2016, The Guardian, the very fine British newspaper, they offered to send me on the road and cover the election, the presidential campaign. And so I said, sure. I mean, I felt like two things were happening. We were in uncharted territory with Trump. But on the other hand, Trump was the logical culmination of a certain strain of American politics and culture and psyche that, if allowed to effloresce, would come to pass. And so on the one hand, uncharted waters, but on the other, an entirely logical result, if certain strains were allowed to develop. So I wrote a series of essays for The Guardian, and then I've spent the last year and a half turning those into a book, which is going to come out in September, nonfiction called Beautiful Country, Burn Again. And so I'll read a little bit from that. And so I went to the Iowa caucuses and tramped around Iowa for a few days and did profiles of Clinton, Sanders, Trump, and Ted Cruz. And so I'll just read you the opening page or two of the profile on Trump called Triumph of the Shrill. You guys, y'all know the TV show Dallas, the old TV show? I mean, yeah. My editor said, a lot of people weren't around when the original Dallas aired, and I was like, well, screw them. I mean, they can go look it up. But I felt like I was onto something here, and so people say, they ask, who is your audience when you're writing us? I'm not thinking about my audience. I'm just trying to get the words on the page correctly. Triumph of the Shrill. One wonders how many tricks Trump poached from JR Ewing, another dashing jerk who crashed the scene in the late 70s and turned the common pieties on their pointy heads. No false modesty from these guys, and no piffle about giving back or serving others or the sacred public trust of the corporate sector. There used to be such a thing. No apologies for having boatloads of money and always wanting more. The first episode of Dallas aired in 1978, precisely the time Trump was swinging his lowball deal for the old Commodore Hotel in New York City. This was the deal that put Trump on the map. And by the time the Commodore reopened in 1980 as the splendiferously flashy Grand Hyatt, Trump's TV soul brother was a mass-market American hero, an international phenomenon. Lorimar Productions had intended for JR to be a secondary character. Bobby, the good brother, was supposed to be the star, a character the show's writers seemed to envision as an embodiment of the manly codes and virtues as set forth in the Boy Scout Handbook, 1957 edition. Bobby was loyal, trustworthy, kind, obedient, etc. Bobby was nice. JR was a snake and a bastard and cheated on his wife. Life has been imitating art for eons, but here was a twist on the old trope. Art imitating life, imitating art, as JR hijacked Lorimar's creative blueprint and made the show his own. Lots of winning for JR those early years. He liked the ladies. He worshipped his father, a rough and tumble striver who built the family fortune up from nothing. JR did big deals, lived large, crushed the competition, and gleefully shredded the illusions of idealistic young people. He had a master negotiator's knack for vibing out the vulnerabilities of the person across the table. Amid the show's weekly dose of clunking melodrama, there was something in JR that felt vital and real, and ratings soared as his character moved front and center. He was the hero we didn't know we'd been looking for, an update on the frontier gunslinger who just happened to do his killing in the boardroom. The man truly did not give a shit about anyone else, though there was his son, John Ross, basically an appendage of the JR ego, a wide-eyed, eager tyke on whom JR was always laying life wisdom with a social Darwinist slant, a perspective that could be summarized as, screw others before they screw unto you, which rang true out here in the real world. JR lied, cheated, and swindled, but no more than the system itself, and he was authentic in the sense that he barely tried to hide it. His honesty was thrilling. One of the sublime, cheap pleasures of television in those years was tuning in each week to see what new havoc JR would inflict on the hypocrites and chumps. He enacted perhaps the oldest of the founding American fantasies, the honky version of paradise where a white man is free to take what he wants. Nobody seemed to notice, it certainly didn't seem to hurt the ratings, that we never saw the Ewings in church. One can imagine Donald Trump studying the JR phenomenon and thinking, I can work with this, just be myself, only more so. Larry Hagman tapped into the pagan id at the heart of good Christian America and found the role of a lifetime. For Trump, the challenge was to take method acting to its extreme, cultivating the raw material of his personality into an ever more authentic performance of himself. At this, he seems to have worked very hard. Nobody has ever described Donald Trump as lazy. His artistry seemed to culminate in the 14 seasons of The Apprentice and The Celebrity Apprentice, in which he starred as himself, the celebrity billionaire Donald Trump. For 14 seasons of primetime TV, network TV, this was how non-Wall Street Journal reading America came to know him, as the brusque, cut-the-bullshit guy at the head of the conference table, whom everyone, celebrities included, reverently addressed as Mr. Trump. In a world where power seems so distant and abstract, where the mysterious things that happen in Washington and New York and Beijing filter down through intricate channels to the rest of us, usually changing our lives for the worse, here was a rare glimpse, however staged and hokey, into the guts of the system. If there was more than a touch of farce in the presentation, the core truth of the show could not be denied, for there was Trump in all his real-life glory, with the planes and helicopters, the gilded office suites, the glam lifestyle, not to mention his own hit TV show. Art imitating life, imitating art, imitating life ad infinitum, one thing affirming the other in an endless loop. So, how about if I stop here and we can have a conversation and maybe we can work in some notions of justice? I mean, you guys are all law students. Y'all ever think about justice? I didn't when I was in law school. I was just trying to get through it. But so where will we do the conversation? Up here? All right. All right. I'm gonna grab my water.
So Ben, it's great to have you here. Ben was in my family law class. I think it might have been in the predecessor room to this. I'm not sure, but it's just great to have you back here and think about how you've, in a sense, escaped us and really made good. So I'm going to ask Ben a few questions, and then we'll open it up for any questions that you might have. So Ben, you talked a little bit about how you go about writing a piece of fiction. Thinking in particular of your Brief Encounters book of stories, most of them involve an American going to a third world country like Myanmar or Haiti or Colombia and interacting with the natives, usually something like the revolutionary insurgents or drug dealers or corrupt government officials, that sort of thing, with a sort of an interesting theme. Could be diamonds, could be drugs, could be fishing. You mentioned in your remarks that your stories come from your characters. Where do you start? Do you start with your character? Do you start with a place? Do you start with a storyline? I mean, how do you sort of begin the process?
I mean, it's different things for different stories. Sometimes it's a situation. And you know, you have these feelings about things. After you do this kind of work for a little while, you develop hopefully a sense of well, I've thought of this. It seems like it has more potential um, than these other things over here. It's just, and you don't know exactly what that potential is, but it's a feeling. You think, well, there's something real here that I want to explore. Maybe it'll help me figure out something about the world. So sometimes it's a character, sometimes it's a particular situation. Like, I mean, I started going to Haiti in 1991 just because I felt like there was a reality out there very different from the middle class American reality. And if I wanted to be a certain kind of writer, I needed to try to engage with that reality. So at one point, I heard about Haitian fishermen finding these huge duffel bags full of cocaine along the southern coast. And what was happening was speedboats were coming in from Colombia. It's about a 10-mile trip across the Caribbean to from the Colombian coast to the southern coast of Haiti. So these Haitian fishermen were finding these duffel bags of cocaine. And at first, they were doing the right thing. They were turning them over to the cops. Well, the cops were just selling it. And so the fishermen got wise and thought, well, you know, the whole system's corrupt. So why should we be the chumps in this? We're going to keep the cocaine and sell it for ourselves, for our own account. And, you know, to me, it just seemed like a juicy situation full of moral ambiguity. But, you know, there's the thing going on there that really intrigued me was what happens when you live in a system where you want to be a good person. You want to be law-abiding and moral, but the system is so corrupt that you aren't allowed to be. If you try to be moral, law-abiding, you might starve. And so, you know, and so what is a human being supposed to do? So situations sometimes, characters sometimes, it just depends.
So in that story, of course, they don't really keep it for themselves. They keep it for their whole, they distribute it among their whole community so that, in a sense, they've found a better way of buttering that bread. So you mentioned moral ambiguity. It seemed to me that your stories really have a tension between a sense of conscience and moral responsibility on the one hand, and, you know, as you say, the realities of the world. And there is a certain character of resignation in your characters, at least in some of them at certain times. Do you consider yourself optimistic or pessimistic about the human condition? I mean, which of these dominates in your thinking about your writing?
Well, it may depend on how much of the news I've watched that day. Optimistic on a personal level, maybe not so much pessimistic as hopefully realistic on the macro level. I think most people, I mean, there's this uncanny thing about human nature, and that is, in most of us, there is this moral impulse. We want to be good people. We want to do good things for other people. We don't want to hurt anybody. So where does that put you when you live in a world, say, you like seafood? You like to eat seafood. It's good for you. Tastes good. And so you know, you're just, as a matter of going about your life, you eat seafood. Knowing that if you're a halfway aware, you know, thinking, informed person, that, you know, seafood stocks are deplenishing, fish stocks are diminishing all over the world. And in fact, there's an economic dynamic going on where, you know, entire large cohorts of people, when those fishing stocks do finally collapse, they are going to face real destitution, if not outright poverty. And so how do you reconcile these two things? And I think where the resignation comes from is it leaves us in some ways impotent. I mean, if we really face this situation, we realize, oh shit, I mean, okay, I'll give up seafood, okay, but I'm still doing these other things. I'm still like eating cows, and I'm still, you know, wearing leather shoes. And so if you're some kind of like saint or aesthetic, ascetic. You know, you devote your life to trying to live without doing harm to anyone. And, you know, my hat's off to those people. But most of us, we don't have the will, we just don't have it in us to live that way.
So a lot of your stories are characters doing the best they can.
Trying to do the right thing, but the system and circumstances hem them in. And so they're trying to find some kind of, you know, wiggle room where they can live a decent life.
So Malcolm Gladwell wrote an essay about you in the New Yorker, so that's something we can all strive for. The essay was about how you were a late bloomer. And your first book was published when you were 48, and you realize that's the same age that Paul Ryan is right now. So keep that in perspective.
Well, who's done better?
I didn't ask that, but yes. So he compares you to the person he calls a prodigy, Jonathan Safran Foer, who was writing books right out of college. And you referred yourself to, it took you a while to write your first book. So are you okay with that? Are you okay with that characterization?
Well, the title of the article is Late Bloomers, which is a nice term for slow learner. I mean, it just took me a long time to figure out how to write a decent story. I wish it had happened faster. God knows I worked hard at it. Along the way, you know, I wrote reams of short stories. I have 2 failed novels under my belt. You know, what can I say? I mean, I guess I'm slow. I mean, kind of thick, guilty as charged. I never claimed to be a genius. It's kind of embarrassing, but it is what it is.
So I don't think he meant it as an insult, though. That's the thing.
No, but
he
that's
really made a virtue.
it's embarrassing. I mean, all right, 10 years in, I was turning 40. I had a dozen short stories published in small, obscure magazines. I had a failed novel. I really had very little to show for this drastic life decision I'd made when I was 30. And nobody wants to live a wasted life. You want to try to accomplish something with your life. And I think most of us, even if we don't want it, we want to have a place in society. We want people to respect us and to be viewed as a validated, you know, card-carrying member of society. If nothing else, we want our families to love us, to feel proud of us. And so after about 10 years, I mean, family gatherings became excruciating. Like these people you see once a year at Christmas. And so the family Christmas party, it's like, well, you know, I keep looking for you in the New Yorker. Or, you know, where's your novel? Or, wow, and not too swift, are you? And so after a while, they just start treating you like, you know, you were in a motorcycle accident and you're brain damaged. And they just kind of, they're like, he's nice, you know, he's harmless, but just don't talk to him for very long. You know, doing this kind of work, you're just on a different timeline, at least I was. So it is what it is. I mean.
Well, to Malcolm Gladwell, it was lots of us give up too early, and some people have the courage to stick with it, and it pays off. So.
Well, I couldn't have done it without Sherry. We met in law school. I told her 15 minutes into our first date, I had no intention of practicing law. My whole life, what I really wanted to do was write books. So she had fair warning. I don't know why I told her that 15 minutes into the first date, but maybe I was trying to impress her in some like futile way. I don't know. But we had talked about it a long time. We lived on one salary. I drove a piece of shit 1977 Grand Prix. So all my friends at the law office were saying, you know, why don't you get something good? But, you know, I had it in the back of my mind, I want the chance to do something like this, and so save all the money you can. But Sherry, she was on board with this, and she's really the hero of that essay by Malcolm Gladwell and also of this whole saga.
So both of your books have been reviewed in the New York Times Book Review. Liesl Schillinger writes about how some novelists stage fictions in hot zones, which she's referring to these countries that are not stable and a lot of poverty and so on. Using the stark drama, I'm using her words, using the stark drama of hostile environs to lend mystique to their main characters and make their transgressions, sins of flesh and faith, appear more archetypal and less blameworthy than they would back home. But Fountain, she says, takes the opposite tack. Rather than glamorize his protagonists through their ties to troubled lands, he humanizes the troubled lands through their ties to his unpretentious protagonists. So the point seems to be here that instead of exoticizing your characters by connecting them to these unfamiliar to any of us countries, you're humanizing those countries through their association with these characters. So do you think she's right? And if so, I'm interested in whether you kind of had this picture in your mind or whether it just happened.
Oh, I can assure you it just happened.
Okay.
I mean, to the extent you get anything right doing this kind of work, it happens line by line, paragraph by paragraph. I mean, you are hanging on by your fingernails just trying to get the correct words on the page. And by that, I mean words that are as accurate to the experience as you can make it, and accurate in all senses of the word, from the externals, to as deep as you can get into the interior life. I mean, human experience is complex. It's very layered. There are levels of articulate thought and then, down from there, and they're all part of our experience. And so the really good writers can mine that territory to a very deep and profound level.
So I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up. When you say really good writers, so is there a writer or two who you think you sure would like to write like they do? That they're sort of your models?
Well, I think we're in a golden age of American writing, both fiction and nonfiction. There's just a lot of good work being done, and the poets are doing tremendous work. I mean, at various times, people have been a revelation to me. When I was in college, Walker Percy, Eudora Welty, but I didn't want to do that whole Southern thing, so I'd lived it. I didn't want to write it. At another point in my life, Garcia Marquez, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and the Latin American writers, Clarice Lispector, Cortázar, they were a revelation to me. And Joan Didion, I think is an extraordinary writer. Toni Morrison is extraordinary. James Baldwin, Saul Bellow. So it depends on who I'm thinking of that day, but those are some of the writers who I wish, you can't write like them, but you can aspire to, in your own way, approach what they're doing.
Questions?
Thanks for being here today. I think Billy Lynn is such an important novel, and thank you for writing that and getting it published. I'm wondering, have you had reactions from people who served in Afghanistan or Iraq, and what have the range of those reactions been for people who've read the novel?
Yeah, to my face, everybody's been really nice. It's a self-selecting audience, the people who will come to your readings or seek you out by mail or email, and they are the ones who want to make contact. They responded to the book in a positive way, and so, over the years, I've gotten so many positive responses that way. There is this other strata of reaction out there, which, go to Amazon, and have a look at some of those, customer reviews, and they will have two aspects to them. One, he has no right to write about this experience because it's not his own experience. I think that is a worthwhile discussion to have. It's something I wrestled with a lot. Do I have the right to go and explore this experience, which is not my firsthand experience? And then the second is he got it wrong. And that's for the reader to judge, and the informed reader. But Veterans, I mean, the ones who have sought me out, the response has been positive.
So where did Billy Lynn come from?
Oh, it came from watching the Dallas Cowboys Thanksgiving Day halftime show in 2004. Bush had just been elected. Notice I didn't say reelected. George W. Bush had just been elected in 2004. And to me, it was it was affirmation and confirmation of a disastrous line of policy for the U.S. And so I was profoundly depressed to the extent I'm capable of profundity on any level. And we had a bunch of people over to the house on Thanksgiving Day, like we always do, and the game's on in the background. And so I'm sitting on the couch, and I'd had a couple of martinis, and the halftime show comes on. And of course, nobody watches the halftime show; they all leave. But I'd had a couple of martinis, and so I'm in that state where you can have dreams and visions and trances. And I actually start watching the halftime show, and it's pretty much the way I write it in the book. It's like this insane mashup of Americana. I mean, from militarism to baton twirlers to Beyonce's Child to, softcore dance moves to softcore porn dance moves to military everywhere. And I thought, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. And I need to think about this some more. So that's where Billy Lynn came in.
So it seems like there the setting may have come first.
It did, that particular situation, yeah. And so then my job was to, mine into it, try to see what was there.
So a few years ago, I guess there was a very prominent film adaptation of Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk by Lee. I was just wondering if you've ever considered writing directly for that format or for television, or whether it's important to you to stick with prose and whether that's really what you're interested in.
Well, I had nothing to do with the movie. I got to meet a lot of good people. Got to hang out with Ang, who's a very fun man. The movie, I don't think was a successful movie. It had its moments, but and since then, I've worked with the producers on that movie toward a TV show, and so I've done some script writing, which I liked, and I think doing that kind of writing loosened me up a little bit. I think it's all to the good. So this TV project, I told them I don't want to do it unless we're getting into real stuff. Otherwise, I got no interest in it. And so we'll see if it happens. It probably won't. But, I liked it. I liked writing scripts. It was, all that scene setting you have to do in fiction, the room and the furniture and the people and all that. All you have to, in scripts, all you have to do is say interior, law school, classroom, and you're in. I mean, it's great.
You mentioned it took you a long time to get into it, and you had a failed novel. Was there any point looking back where you looked at your work and you realized it was different, or you realized that all of a sudden this was turning into something that you really felt was going in a positive direction, would be successful? If you wouldn't mind talking about that point.
I mean, there were moments where I would write a sentence that felt right. I mean, in those early years, amid all this bad stuff, it was like something would hit home and it felt genuine. And the pleasure I got out of that was inordinate. I could see myself slowly, gradually getting a little better in fits and starts. At about 10 years in, I felt like, okay, I really am getting better. I may never publish a book, but I'm not hurting anybody. And I'm staying at home, I'm taking care of the kids, I'm running the house. Sherry can go 100% at her career. And, I'll just live my little life here in North Dallas. Everybody on my block thought I was a drug dealer or something. Because I had no job. It was even worse when they found out I was a Democrat. So that's a different story. So there were moments along the way, but I had to get very zen about it. As far as letting go of those external expectations where, the fantasy life where, you know, just right out of the gate or 5 years in, you have your breakthrough and you get the big novel and the big contract and, you know, you win all the awards. I just had to let that go and focus on the writing.
Tom?
Now met such success, do you ever consider revisiting those earlier novels that you'd written?
No. No, I'm interested. I mean, I'm interested in moving on. There's other things I want to explore. Maybe the same things, but in different situations. But to try to drag that old work like into the present would be, plus it's so depressing. I mean, just the associations with that work, you know, those were painful years. And so they have been put away.
Of course, now people would read it just because they know you're so good.
Well, they aren't going to read it if I have anything to do with
So,
it.
do you have, there may be a student or two in this room who dreams of being a novelist someday. Do you have any advice for them? And I urge you not to make it so attractive that they won't be motivated to study for their final exams.
Well, isn't that tempting? Just to say, it doesn't really matter because I'm going to go write novels.
Yes.
Yeah.
Advice.
I would say if you're intending to go practice law, go practice law. Learn everything you can from it. I'm glad I did it for 5 years. I did real estate finance in Dallas, so I lived in a world where not many writers live. I mean, it was my life. So you get a view into the way things work, what motivates people, how good they can be and how terrible they can be. So take it as part of your education, practicing law. Save everything you can. I had 5 suits. I drove that junker car. You know, we lived very modestly just because I had this notion I might want to try to write someday. And so money is freedom. You can't want the things this society wants you to want if you're going to do this kind of work. Psychologically, it's not an easy life unless and until you get validated by the outside culture. I mean, those apprentice years when you really have nothing to show for it, you're going to walk into a party and people are going to say, well, what do you do? And you say, well, I'm a writer. Then they'll say, oh, tell me about your books. And you'll say, well, I haven't actually published any books. And so then they're like, I got to go get another drink. I mean, you know, you're kind of like a crustacean without a shell. You don't have validation. And so you just have to deal with that. Make up your mind that you are after something other than that. Having said that, it's also a wonderful life. You get to follow your head and your heart wherever they lead. You don't have a boss. You can, you know, assuming you're keeping body and soul together on the money side, you can explore whatever you want to explore. And I mean, it's a life devoted to art. And that can be a really satisfying life. Young lady back there who's, yes, you've been holding up your hand.
So it's kind of funny because I'm actually somewhat in a similar position. I met my husband when I was in law school, and he's now, I mean, he was never in law school, but he's writing now. Like I guess my question is, from my side, from my perspective, how was it when you found your voice, and how was that with you and your wife, and giving you room to find that voice, that thing that was uniquely you? Because you talk about it took a while to find how to make a good story, but the good story doesn't matter if you don't, I think, have your own voice to put into the world yourself.
Well, the voice is the story. I mean, voice is the attitude, the perspective you bring to the material, which is filtered through the language. It's not decoration or you know, style. It really goes to the heart of things. My wife Sherry is a saint. She never once got on my case about not making any money. Can you imagine an American woman like not giving you? I mean, I'm just saying it's unusual and rare, especially in Dallas. She gave me time and space, and that's all a writer can honestly ask for.
Richard?
I'm about to have dinner with a reunion class, yours, in fact, in a couple of days. and something I've noticed when I go to reunions is that the further out you go, actually two things. The further out you go, the larger the percentage of class that's not practicing law anymore. But another thing I've noticed, and this is a self-selected audience, which may have some influence on that, but almost invariably the people who are not practicing law nevertheless will say that they're awfully glad they went to law school. You might be the ultimate test case of that, because the contribution of your legal education to what you've done for the last 20 years is about as low as I imagine it could be. Maybe I'm wrong, and I'd just like to know, this is sort of a test case. Would you still say you're happy you went to law school, or was this 3 wasted years, or maybe worse than wasted? Maybe they, depressed your creativity, which added to that 10-year drought after you started.
Well, yeah,
What's your thought?
yeah. I think going to law school and practicing law held me back in the short and medium term, because I was very set into this lockstep kind of legal thinking, where you have A and then you go to B and then you go to C, and it all has to follow very logically and in order. And it took me a while to realize that writing fiction, it has its own kind of logic, but it's emotional logic. And you are allowed to go from A to D, D back to B, B to X, and which is truer to human nature and to how we live our lives. So I would say in the short and medium term, I mean, one of my early stories, I was writing about a woman who's just gotten a divorce from a wealthy man, but she's got no money. So I'm writing about money in American society. Well, I found myself reading Spengler, Oswald Spengler, to try to figure out money. It's like, that was crazy. I mean, but I felt like I had to have this background. I was ignoring the emotional part of the story and instead, focusing on the exteriors. Over the long term, I'd say, yeah, I'm really glad I went to law school. I'm glad I practiced law. It was an education in the world. It's an entree into getting some handle on how things work in the world. I especially appreciate it the last 2 years. It's a way to, it's a lens through which to view, I mean, to me, the utterly insane turns that American society has taken, not just in the last 2 years, but really since the early 80s. And so I think law is a useful thing to have in your head, to think with as you're watching all this. And as traditions, norms in society continue to fray, it's helpful to have a legal education, to have some idea of where you stand, because I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, if it gets better.
Well, Ben, I think we have to wrap this up. I think since you ended on a positive note about law school, it'd be a particularly good time to stop. As a representative of this law school, I have to say, if it's not too condescending, that we are very proud of you. And I'm also personally hugely inspired by you. And I think other people who have heard your story, including hopefully some folks today, are as well.
Thank
So
you very much.
much.
I really appreciate that. Thank you all for having me.